First Junior debate. The topic of today's debate is that students should be required to walk or to take public transport to school. On the affirmative team we have Declan, Emily and Lara, and on the negative team we have Georgia, Sierra and Alex. I would like to call upon Declan to open the affirmative team's case.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that all school students should be required to walk or take public transport to school. We believe there currently exists issues with children's health as well as the access of education across all students, and it is responsibility of the government to try and fix this. We believe that forcing all students to either walk or take public transport to school will have a positive impact on this. We define public transport as alternatives to private transport such as buses and trains, as well as encouraging walking and riding bicycles. We propose a model that all school students be required to walk or take public transport to school. We will also make public transport free for all of these school students and provide special arrangements for those that need it. Tonight I have 2 points. The first one is the role of government, and the second is the physical health of school students. We believe the government has responsibility to support school children, specifically to ensure that they are healthy and that all have equal access to education. We also believe that strong communities are of benefit and the government should be promoting this. Firstly, we see that parents, often through no fault of their own, are unable to consistently and with ease get their children to school. We believe this has large negative effects on the child's ability to receive a successful education and therefore impacted throughout their life. We believe by making public transport free and having extra public transport for those that need it, we can have all students receiving similar levels of education. Secondly, we see similarly the parents are able to always pass on positive, healthy habits onto their children. This is often because parents are either too busy to do so, or maybe they weren't taught them themselves. We believe that the government, through enforcing small walks each day, either all the way to school or to public transport, we can have positive impacts on children's health. Finally, it's not always easy for parents to bring the community together, whether through not having enough time or the willingness to do so. And we believe that encouraging students to walk together to schools locally, we can encourage community connectivity. Tonight, my second point is the physical health of children. And this comes in 2 different ways. Firstly, the immediate impact on their health and thereby their schooling, etc. And the second one is the long-term effects of creating good habits. Firstly, we believe that there currently exists a moderate to large health problem within all ages of Australians. We see that by having students do small amounts of exercise each day, that we can improve the health of children immediately. Currently, children probably don't do enough exercise, and we can help assist with that. Secondly, the long-term effects to Australians is that if we can have positive exercise habits from a young age, they can take that through their lives, and this will have a positive long-term effect on their health and their exercise habits. Tonight I have had 2 points. The first one is the role of government to ensure children's health and access to education, and the second was the immediate and long-term health effects on Australians. Thank you.
I would like to thank Declan for his speech and call upon Georgia to open the affirmative team's case.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that students should be required to walk or catch public transport to school. We, as the negative team, strongly believe that this is false, and tonight we will provide you with 4 reasons why. We agree with the affirmative team's definition. Rather than forcing children to walk or catch public transport to school, we propose the following counter model: that the government should introduce free, accessible public transport for students and invest in better footpaths and bike paths around schools. This will allow parents and students to make the decision to use the facilities if they wish, but without forcing them. Before I go on to my case, I would like to point out some flaws in the affirmative team's argument. First, the first speaker of the Affirmative team said that it is the government's role to dictate that students get to school in a particular way in order to promote their well-being. We disagree with this because whilst it is the government's responsibility to ensure that all children are educated, parents know their individual child better and therefore can make decisions best suited to them personally. Secondly, the first speaker of the Affirmative team said that their model will improve students' physical fitness. Whilst there are some health benefits from walking to school, under their model, more children will be obliged to catch buses and trains to school, taking up valuable time that children could use to play sports. Allowing students to get to school in a way that suits them best will most likely result in them having more time to exercise in ways they enjoy, such as swimming, soccer, netball with their friends. This is a far better form of physical exercise for the children as it actually teaches them to enjoy physical exercise. Tonight I have 2 points. They are, firstly, that the Affirmative team's model infringes parents' and children's freedom of choice, and secondly, the increased dangers of the Affirmative team's model. Now on to my first point about the right of freedom of choice by parents and children. What the Affirmative team has proposed would result in a loss of freedom of choice, as it would see the government dictating how a child has to live their life. Already, we allow parents to make a vast number of decisions for their children, such as where they are educated, where they live, what they eat, and what they do after school. These are choices that we recognise that parents and older children have the right to make for themselves. Leaving the decision to them about how a child travels to school is an individual freedom, which also allows families to make choices about what is best for them. For example, a single mum trying to organise getting her 3 children to 3 different schools and trying to juggle working 50 hours a week doesn't have time to walk the younger 2 to school and organise a bus route for the eldest. Now on to my second point, the dangers of public transport. What the Affirmative team has failed to realise is the increased dangers that come with putting children on public transport or walking to school. Already there is a risk of kidnapping, made all too obvious by the tragic case of Daniel Morcombe and dozens of other children around Australia. This risk would be increased by having more children responsible for getting themselves to school. There is also the higher risk of other injuries happening to children while they are getting themselves to school, being hit by cars, bitten by dogs, but also smaller injuries such as rolling their ankle when there's no one there to help. All of these dangers, no matter how big or small, will have an impact on the child's ability to get to school and learn effectively once they are there, which is what the government should truly be prioritising. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I have given you 2 reasons why students should not be required to walk to school or catch public transport. They were, firstly, the rights of children and parents to make choices about what is best for them, and secondly, the dangers associated with the Affirmative team's model. For these reasons, I am proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank Georgia for her speech and now call upon Emily to continue the Affirmative team's case.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I continue with my team's case, I would like to point out 2 flaws in the opposition's case. Firstly, their point about individual freedom, and secondly, their point about the danger of walking or catching public transport to school. Now to their first point about freedom of choice. So they told us that parents should be able to make a decision for their children because they make plenty of choices all the time and they know their children best. However, this is wrong because, as we even told you at first speaker, there are lots of decisions the government makes about children's lives every day. And even though this might be a slight inconvenience for a few children, we think that we get so many benefits through better health outcomes and better safety for the community. And that's why we think that this isn't actually an infringement on their freedom of choice that isn't justified. And that's why we believe all students should be required to walk or catch public transport to school. Secondly, they told us it can be dangerous for students and that there are many dangers of public transport. However, as we've told you, that whilst there are some dangers sometimes, we think it's better if everyone in the community bands together, and there's actually less dangers for all children, as I'll explain in my second point, because you have everyone walking to school together and the communities all around, as opposed to just a few children facing danger. But also we think that most of the time there's very little danger and there's lots of safety mechanisms set up, so it's not a big issue. And that's why we think all students should be required to walk or catch public transport to school. Today I'll present 2 points. Firstly, about why it's better for the environment, and secondly, why it's more equal for all students. So now to my first point about the environment. So we think that at the moment, many children are driven to school, and that passenger vehicles are a major polluter, and they contribute more than half of the carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxides emitted into the air, which is a huge driver of global warming, which is terrible for the environment. We changed this because all kids will now be walking or catching public transport to school, which means that there will be less cars on the road, particularly at peak time. As a result, in the short term, there will be less cars emitting pollution, which is going to be great for the environment. But secondly, we think that this will help them create healthy habits for life, because the kids will get used to catching the bus and get used to walking to school, and that will mean that in the rest of their life, they're more likely to have these healthy habits, which will be way better for the environment. We think this is really important because we only have one planet to live on and we need to take care of it, which is why we should require all students to walk to school or catch public transport. Now to my second point about how it's more equal for students. So at the moment, there are some students who are driven to school and some who are required to walk or catch public transport. And I think this can create a bit of a social divide within the school that leaves some feeling left out, but also it creates a situation of danger because not all students are actually travelling together, and there are a few that are just required to do it alone. We changed this because now, under our model, all students will be catching public transport to school and all students will be walking to school. As a result of that, we'll have a strengthened community as people will be able to negotiate more walking groups to school, and there'll be more students at the bus stop together. So we'll strengthen the community, we'll have more safety for students, and students will feel more equal to each other, and they'll be able to make, have better peer groups. I think this is really important because while it might make things slightly more inconvenient for a few students, we think that overall it helps bring the community together, creates more safety, and it makes it for a more equal schooling experience. In summary tonight, I've had 2 points. Firstly, about why this is important for the environment, and secondly, about how it creates more equality. And for these reasons, we are very proud to propose.
I would like to thank Emily for her speech and now call upon Sierra to continue the negative team's case.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight I'd like to bring you 2 points. Firstly, why students who live far away are harmed by the Affirmative team's policy, and secondly, why you reduce family time between students and parents. Before that, I'd like to bring you 2 points of rebuttal. Firstly, on why you harm students' welfare in regards to the issue about the freedoms and the decisions of parents, and secondly, in regards to health, and lastly, on the environment. On that point about the welfare of children, the Affirmative team tells us that the government has the right to make decisions about the quality of life of these children and whether or not they should be walking or taking public transport. But notably, parents are in a far better position to make these decisions, because if your child is sick temporarily, is being bullied, or maybe just suffering from a different ailment, they are going to need to potentially be driven to school. Those are things that the government can never account for. That's why parents are the best decision makers. Secondly, they tell us that children are going to walk in groups, so all of our material about getting kidnapped doesn't necessarily apply. The reason why that's not true is that particularly for children who live in areas of high crime rates, even a group of children is still a potentially vulnerable group to getting kidnapped or harmed. Lastly, on the issue of equality here, they tell us people who live far away are going to be now on a parity level with people who live close. You're still going to be disadvantaged, we tell you though, because you have to take a longer train ride, you have to work further. We tell you only increase the gap between those students who are less privileged and those who are more privileged. Secondly, on the environment, they tell us now you have less cars on the road and you decrease pollution. Why is that not true? Firstly, a lot of cars who drive their children to school are already going to work, so we think you're likely to have a similar amount of pollution under their side anyway. But secondly, you're going to have to substantially increase public transport to accommodate for all of these students in the entirety of Australia who now need to catch buses. Obviously, these are bigger machines and bigger vehicles, meaning that you have to account for the relative increase in the pollution you're going to get from having a big bus compared to a little car. Now onto my points. Firstly, why students who live far away are disadvantaged. Firstly here, I'd like to note that many students live far away because they need to go to selective schools that have better quality teaching, religious schools, or just specialty programs, and the cost of boarding is too great for them. This is really harmful because it takes up a lot of their time, even if they take the train. That actually manifests in them having to go to school tired, not being able to concentrate in their lessons, and falling behind in classes, meaning they just don't enjoy school as much. You disadvantage all of those students. Secondly, on my second point about why you reduce quality family time. A lot of parents work a lot, and the only time they actually have with their children is in those car rides where they can talk to them. If you have a limited time to spend with your children, we think it is really harmful that you force those children never to get to spend those precious moments with their parents bonding and talking to them. You lose that closeness that keeps a family close, and you harm that inter-family dynamic. I've given you 2 points to recap here. Firstly, why you harm students who live far away, and secondly, why you reduce quality family time and harm those students. Thank you.
I would like to thank Sierra for her speech and call upon Laura to conclude the Affirmative team's case.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we had an opposition who have based a lot of their response
responses and one of their second speaker points on this idea that public transport was necessarily going to be slower and more difficult than any other form of transport. We didn't think that was true because at the point at which these buses were just using the same roads as the cars where parents were supposedly driving their kids to school with, this wasn't a problem. That got rid of all of their material about kids living further away being disadvantaged. So we thought that that was very harmful for their case. I'm going to talk about 3 issues in this speech. Firstly, on the issue of parents' choice versus whether the government should be acting. Secondly, on outcomes for the individual. And thirdly, on broader outcomes and second speaker material. So on this first issue of parents' choices versus the government, the opposition tell us that, well, this is a bad thing because it's going to restrict people's freedom of choice. But we tell you firstly that these parents weren't as good at making decisions as they wanted to tell us that they were. Why was this? We think that it's because parents don't have the same long-term vision that people like the government have. They don't have all of the information available to them to make choices about what is actually going to be best for their child. And they're also more likely to have bias and to think that their child is going to be fine with them driving them because that's what they want to do. But even if we thought that parents were very good at making choices, we still give you reasons at second as to why it's not really important whether that parent is good at making the choice. Because if a choice harms the individual and it harms broader society, we can infringe on their freedom of choice. We thought that the choice to not use public transport did harm the individual because of their health, but also because it privileged some over others, and it harms a broader society because it was always going to be worse for the environment. So we thought at the end of this issue, what we proved was that it was the government's role to intervene in these people's lives and not their parents. On the second issue of outcomes for the individual, there were 3 subcategories under this: health, danger, and then on whether this was fair to people or not. On this first subpoint of health, we told you that it was going to be more healthy for people to walk or ride to school. The opposition's response to this is that more people are going to be using buses and trains. We think that that's not necessarily true, but even if these people did use buses and trains, they still had to walk to the bus stop. That was an improvement. If the 2 worlds are under the opposition side, no people are walking, and under our side more people do, that's still a benefit for us. But moreover, as I mentioned in my introduction, it didn't take that much longer to get to school, so you could probably still do swimming, even if you caught the bus or walked. The second thing under this point was on danger. The opposition say, we think that the opposition really overstated how dangerous this was actually going to be for people, because measures currently existed, like the fact that bus drivers had to let you on post the Daniel Malcolm example that they gave us. These things show that people are willing to make changes and improve on these public transport systems, but we also give you the comparative that under our side, more people are going to be on these public transports. That not only makes you safer because you're in a group, but it also brings up this issue to the government, to the public, and they're more likely to want to put in more measures in place. It was always going to be safer under our side. Third thing in this issue is just on equality. We give you many reasons why socioeconomic gaps come up when you see who's being driven to school in their parents' nice car versus you having to walk. We thought we got rid of that, and the opposition's material about living further away was not up to the standard because we tell you that this wouldn't happen under our side. Very briefly on the third issue, we tell you that the environment was very important, and their material about cars already driving places wasn't that powerful because it ignored the fact that we also tell you we create long-term habits for these children. We also thought that the idea of making more buses being harmful was wrong because you had more people in those buses. Carpooling was effective. Finally, and briefly, just to mention quality time, we thought that parents could always walk with their children or take the bus with them, and it was wrong to say that children who existed presently were somehow worse off if they walked to school. So in conclusion, our team covered the role of government, how to make things healthy, being good for the environment, and more equality, and for those reasons we were so proud to propose.
To thank Laura for her speech and call upon Alex to conclude the Affirmative team's case.
Before I get into any of my rebuttal tonight, I just quickly want to cover something that our second speaker said about the environment, because this was very important, because it meant that the Affirmative team's entire point on the environment wasn't that important. Our second speaker brought up that parents still have to drive to work. You still have the same amount of parents driving around, but now you have the increased weight put on the public transport system. You simply have more buses, and you're having buses driving out into the middle of nowhere because a child who's 30 minutes away cannot walk to school. You simply just had the same amount of carbon emissions, if not more, under Affirmative team's side of the house. And as such, even in our worst case scenario, we came out even on the environment. Before I get into my summary, 3 key issues with tonight's debate. So firstly, looking at the freedom of choice versus the government. And what this really came down to was, could Affirmative team show us that the health and the education was better for these children when they had to walk to school? We said that it wasn't, because simply at the point where you did have some children who had to catch the bus, for 30 minutes or walk for an obscene amount of time, even if they were in the minority, that really hurt their capacity to get a proper education. And we never thought it was fair to steal that education specifically from some children because they lived so far away. But secondly, and I'll get into this later, talking about health, we said we didn't think that they were likely to actually engage in the health programs properly at the point where they were being forced to do it and they wouldn't want to do it into the future. Finally, on this point, we never thought the government actually had to make this decision. We thought, as we said in our counter model, that if we simply just implement these things, we can allow them to choose it. And given that we think parents care about their children and their health, if it is feasible, they will probably have their children walk to school or catch the bus. The second issue we had was about physical and mental health and what that meant. So firstly, Affirmative team had a lot of information about why it was so much better for the children to walk to school. There were a few issues with this. Firstly, at the point where you're forced to walk to school or walk to the bus stop, you probably didn't want to do that into the future by virtue of the fact you were being forced to do it and it wasn't your own choice. But secondly, as we brought up early in our case, you were taking that time away from other activities that they could be doing, which were a lot more enjoyable, like going out and kicking the soccer ball around with your friends before school. We thought this was probably more likely to make you want to continue to be active into the future. But secondly, within this, we also had this fact about mental health, that it was very important for children to be able to drive to school and talk with their parents, particularly when they didn't have that ability otherwise. You weren't really able to have parents catch the bus and walk their children to school because those parents still had to get to work themselves. And as such, the only way we had that family dynamic was by allowing the parents to drive their children to school. On this final issue of safety, we thought what was most important within this was, regardless of everything else that happened in the debate, if you had your child get abducted or your child got seriously hurt, that was something that we thought was completely unacceptable for the government to do, regardless if it helped a lot of children's health. We thought protecting that child's physical safety was the most important thing, and we think that regardless of any health benefits, if that child would not come home that night, we thought that was absolutely abhorrent. Now onto the summary for our team's case. We brought you at first that there was a moral freedom of choice, that these families and children should be able to choose what they did. Secondly, that public transport was particularly dangerous. And then second, we brought you that it was very difficult for children living far away and was unfair on them compared to other students. And finally, that you would lose out on key and core family time that you wouldn't be able to have otherwise. Thank you.